Have you ever wondered how absolute your right to protest really is? Well, in Singapore, the Constitution itself sets up this fascinating balancing act between the freedom to assemble and the need for public order. So let's dive in and see how that actually works.
So let's start with the big question. Are fundamental rights absolute? It's a huge debate, right? It sparks arguments all over the world. But in Singapore's legal framework, the answer is kind of written directly into the Constitution itself. And this slide really gets to the heart of the matter. You can see the core tension right here. On one side, you've got the individual's right to gather, to make their voice heard. And on the other, you have the state's duty to make sure everything runs smoothly and safely. The entire legal structure we're about to unpack is designed to manage this exact conflict.
To really get our heads around this balance, we have to look at the legal foundation. And for that, we turn to Article 14 of the Singapore Constitution. Now, the way Article 14 is set up is pretty unique. See, in a lot of constitutions, you'll find rights in one section and the limitations somewhere else entirely. But here, they're bundled together. The very same article that gives you the right to assemble also gives Parliament the power to put limits on it. And that, right there, is a super foundational concept in Singaporean law. Okay, so the Constitution says Parliament can restrict rights by law. But what does law even mean here? You might think it's just, a bill passed in Parliament, but it's way, way broader than that. We're talking about written statutes, for sure, but also the whole body of common law inherited from the English system and even established customs that have the force of law. It's a really wide net.
So if a law seems to step on the right to assemble, how do the courts figure it all out? How do they decide if it's actually constitutional? Well, they don't just wing it. They use a very specific three-step test that comes from a landmark case. Let's break it down.
This test, which comes out of the Jolivon Wham case, is basically the roadmap. First up, does the law actually restrict the right? Simple enough. Step 2, did Parliament think this restriction was necessary or expedient? And finally, Step 3, is there a clear link, a nexus, between the law and a goal the Constitution allows, like maintaining public order?
All right, Step 1. This one's pretty straightforward, honestly. The court just looks at the law in question and asks a simple question. Does this thing, as a matter of fact, limit a constitutional right like freedom of assembly? Yes or no?
Now for Step 2, and this is where things get really interesting. The court has to figure out if Parliament thought the restriction was necessary or expedient. Now the key thing to get here is that the court isn't asking if they think the law is necessary. Nope. Their job is to look back at the records, at the debates, to understand what Parliament's original intent was. So just how much power does that little phrase, necessary or expedient, give to Parliament? Well, this quote from another major case, Chi Seok Chen, lays it out in black and white. It gives Parliament an extremely wide discretionary power. That means the courts tend to give a lot of weight to what Parliament decides is needed for the country. That word expedient is a big deal because it opens the door to something called a prophylactic approach. Sounds complicated, but all prophylactic means is preventative. So Parliament doesn't have to wait for a problem to pop up before it acts. It can create laws designed to prevent threats to public order from ever happening in the first place. It's about being proactive, not just reactive. And finally, Step 3. There's got to be a clear, objective link, what lawyers call a nexus, between the law itself and one of those permitted reasons for the restriction, like public order. The law can't just be for any old reason. It has to be directly connected to a legitimate constitutional goal. Okay, so let's pull back for a second. When you put all three of those steps together, what's the big picture you get? You get a system that gives Parliament an incredibly wide amount of freedom to act, especially when it comes to being preventative. Now, the courts are very specific about how they see their job. They don't call it weighing, where you just put two things on a scale and one crushes the other. They call it balancing, and that's a really vital difference. It means the court sees both the individual's right and the state's interest as legitimate, valid values that exist side by side in the Constitution. The goal isn't to pick a winner, but to hold them in a careful equilibrium.
And that phrase, in the interest of public order, man, that gets interpreted really broadly. Like we've seen, it's not just about stopping a riot that's already happening. It gives the government a wide remit to pass laws that are aimed at preventing future threats. And that all goes back to that prophylactic or preventative strategy we just talked about.
So, after all that legal deep dive, where does this leave us? What's the point of this whole system? Well, it's really all about one thing: trying to find the right balance in that fundamental relationship between the citizen and the state. In the end, it all comes back to this.
The fundamental goal is to strike a balance between the liberty of the individual and the interest of the public as a whole. Neither one is seen as absolute. Instead, they're both seen as essential parts of a healthy society that have to be held in this careful, constant tension.
All right, so let's do a quick recap. What are the big things to remember from all this? First, Singapore's constitution is unique because the rights and their limits live together in the very same article. Second, the courts use a clear three-step test to check any restrictions on those rights. Third, this whole setup gives Parliament wide preventative powers. And finally, the ultimate goal isn't about one side winning, but about finding a balance between these competing interests.
And that leaves us with one last big question. A question for you, really. Singapore's legal framework provides one answer, but every single society has to grapple with this. In that constant push and pull between our individual rights and our collective needs, where do you think the line should be drawn?